She covered a veteran's heart pills every month. She never asked for anything in return, just wanted him to stay alive. Sarah Thompson was a pharmacy clerk in a small Montana town, working long hours to make ends meet. George Bennett was a quiet customer, a veteran who couldn't afford his medicine. One day, the Air Force flew in to honor Sarah, and everything changed. Why did the Air Force come for George? What did they do for Sarah? Have you ever paid for someone's medicine without expecting a reward? Let's find out. Welcome to True Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small Montana town, the winters are brutal. Sarah Thompson lived there. She was 29 years old. She worked as a clerk at Dawson's Pharmacy, a modest drugstore on Pine Street. Sarah's shifts were long. She scanned prescriptions, stocked shelves, and counted pills, her hands steady from years of routine. She smiled for customers, even when her back ached, even when the bills piled up, even when the weight of her dreams felt too heavy to carry. Her blonde hair was always tied back in a loose ponytail, her uniform a faded blue, her eyes tired but kind. A kindness that came from a heart that had known struggle, that had known loss, that had known hope, a heart that gave even when it had little to give, even when the world didn't give back, even when the cold seemed to take more than it offered. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment above the pharmacy, a cramped space with cracked walls, a leaky faucet, and a heater that barely worked, its hum a constant reminder of the things she couldn't fix, of the things she couldn't afford, of the things she couldn't change. Her parents had passed away years ago, her father from a stroke, her mother from grief a year later, leaving Sarah to fend for herself, to chase her dream of opening a community clinic, to keep going in a town that seemed to move on without her. Sarah worked hard, but she had a kind heart. She gave kindness. It was all she could afford. Sarah's life in Whitefish, Montana, was a daily struggle against time and circumstance. The town had seen better days, its streets lined with faded signs, its shops struggling to stay open, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Whitefish was a small community, just over 8,000 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where Dawson's Pharmacy had been a fixture for decades, a spot where locals picked up their meds, shared gossip, and found a moment of warmth, a place that Sarah's boss, Mr. Dawson, had built, that Sarah had grown to love, that Sarah fought to keep alive, even when the odds were against her, even when the rent notices piled up, even when the world seemed to forget the pharmacy, to forget her dreams, to forget her. She grew up in Whitefish, in a small house on Cedar Avenue, where her parents had raised her with love, with grit, with the belief that kindness was the greatest gift you could give, that hope was the greatest thing you could hold, that dreams were the greatest thing you could chase, even when the world was cold, even when the nights were long, even when the struggles were heavy. Her father, John, had been a mechanic, his hands rough as he fixed cars, his voice warm as he sang old country songs, his laughter a bright spot in their small home, a laughter that Sarah still heard even now, years after he was gone, years after the stroke took him, years after the pharmacy became her refuge, her burden, her life. Her mother, Helen, had been a nurse, her smile a comfort to every patient, her hands quick as she bandaged wounds, her faith a steady anchor for their family, her prayers a nightly ritual that Sarah still whispered even now, years after she was gone, years after the grief took her, years after the pharmacy became her responsibility, her memory, her love. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty, stew on Sundays, oatmeal on weekdays, a rare treat of pie when the budget allowed. But they had each other, and that made their small house a haven, a place where Sarah always felt safe, always felt loved, always felt whole. Those memories were all Sarah had left after her parents passed, a double loss that came in the span of a year. Her father's stroke a sudden blow on a quiet winter night, her mother's grief a slow fade that ended the following fall, leaving a void Sarah couldn't fill. She'd been 22 then, fresh out of college with a pharmacy technician certificate, her dream of opening a community clinic burning bright, her heart heavy with loss, with debt, with a life that seemed to demand more than she could give, more than she could bear, more than she could hold. She took the job at Dawson's Pharmacy, working long hours to pay off her student loans, to save for her clinic, to keep her parents' memory alive, even when the bills piled up, even when the customers dwindled, even when the world seemed to forget the pharmacy, to forget her dreams, to forget her. She worked from morning to night, her hands steady as she counted pills, her back aching from standing all day, her heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of responsibility, with the weight of a dream that seemed so far away, a dream that seemed to slip further with every late bill, a dream that seemed to demand more than she could give, more than she could bear, more than she could hold. But Sarah had a kind heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons her parents taught her, with the love they'd shared, with the hope she held for her clinic, a hope that lived on in the small acts of kindness she offered, even now, even here, even in the shadows where no one saw her, where no one cared, where no one knew. She worked with care, taking pride in the prescriptions she filled, making sure every customer was cared for, every pill was counted, every smile was genuine, a quiet gift to the people who filled her days, even if they never noticed, even if they never thanked her, even if they never saw the effort she put in, the love she poured into every task, the heart she gave to every interaction. One chilly afternoon in early November, as Sarah was restocking shelves at Dawson's Pharmacy, the bell above the door jingled softly. She looked up, her hands pausing mid-task, and saw a familiar figure shuffle in, a man she'd come to know. Over the past year, a man whose quiet presence always tugged at her heart, a man who carried a weight she couldn't name but could feel, even in the silence, even in the cold, even in the moments that passed between them. He was an elderly gentleman, his step slow, his back hunched, his coat threadbare and patched, his face etched with lines of hardship, of sorrow, of a life that had left him with little, a life that had taken much, a life that had left him on the edges of a town that seemed to move on without him. Something about him made Sarah pause, a sense of recognition in the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity despite his circumstances, a strength that shone through the layers of hardship, that clung to him like the frost on the windows, a strength Sarah understood, a strength she felt, a strength she couldn't ignore. She didn't know his full story, didn't know the weight he carried, but she knew the look in his eyes, the look of a man who'd lost everything, the look of a man who needed help, who needed kindness, who needed hope, even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Sarah smiled, her hand steady as she set down the box of bandages, as she walked over, as she greeted him, even if she didn't know his past, even if she didn't know his pain, even if she didn't know what would come of it. The man's name was George Bennett, though Sarah only knew him as Mr. Bennett, didn't know the story behind those weary eyes, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. George was 78 years old, a veteran of the Korean War, a man who'd served as a pilot in the U.S. Air Force, who'd flown missions over the skies of Korea in 1952, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his squadron during a critical mission, landing his damaged plane under enemy fire to rescue a downed pilot, his own body battered by shrapnel, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't, saved by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him into the pharmacy where he now stood, where he now waited, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, On the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, the dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. George had lost everything. After the war, his family, his home, his health, his very sense of self, the war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to Whitefish in 1954, a different man than the one who'd left. His eyes harder, his smile gone, his heart heavier with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife, Margaret, had tried to help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the nightmares were too much, the flashbacks too real, the guilt too heavy, the trauma too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Margaret couldn't hold on anymore, until she passed away from cancer in 1975, leaving George alone with their son, David, a son who grew up and moved away, seeking a life far from the shadow of a father who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. George didn't blame him, didn't fight him, didn't beg him to stay, knowing he was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the father David deserved, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. George had been. Coming to Dawson's pharmacy for months, a prescription for heart pills clutched in his trembling hands, a prescription he couldn't afford, a prescription that kept him alive, a prescription that reminded him of the life he'd lost, of the health he'd lost, of the years that had slipped away, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the moments that passed him by. He lived in a small shack on the edge of town, a crumbling structure with no heat, no running water, no comfort, a place where he kept his few possessions, a place where he kept his memories, a place where he kept his silence, a silence that had become his home, his truth, his everything. Inside the shack was a faded photo of Margaret and David, taken on David's 10th birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny park backdrop, a moment of joy frozen in time, a moment George held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Margaret wrote him during the war. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible. Words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights. Words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. And there was his distinguished Flying Cross, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in Korea, a medal he'd buried in a box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. Sarah noticed George on his first visit. The way his hands trembled as he handed her the prescription, the way his voice cracked as he admitted he didn't have the money, the way his eyes dropped as he turned to leave, resigned to the fate of a man who couldn't afford to live, who couldn't afford to hope, who couldn't afford to dream, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. She didn't know his story, didn't know his past, didn't know the weight he carried, but she knew the look in his eyes, the look of a man who needed help, who needed kindness, who needed hope, even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. That day, Sarah reached into her own pocket, her hands trembling as she pulled out her own money, her heart heavy as she thought of the man before her, as she thought of the cold, as she thought of the life she knew he needed, the life she'd needed, the life she couldn't let slip away. She paid for the pills, her voice steady as she called him back, as she handed him the medicine, as she smiled. Even if she didn't know his story, even if she didn't know his pain, even if she didn't know what would come of it. For months, Sarah paid for George's heart pills, a small act of kindness that became a ritual, a quiet promise between two souls who'd never spoken much, who'd never needed to, who understood each other in the way only the lonely can, in the way only those who've known loss can, in the way only those who've been forgotten can. Each time George came to Dawson's pharmacy, his hands trembling as he handed her the prescription, his eyes downcast as he admitted he couldn't pay, Sarah would reach into her own pocket, her heart heavy with the weight of his need, with the weight of her own struggles, with the weight of a dream she feared she'd never reach, a dream of opening a community clinic, a dream that seemed so far away, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept her apart. She never asked for anything in return, never told anyone, never let George feel small for needing help, for needing kindness, for needing hope, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know her name, even if he didn't know her story, even if he didn't know the weight she carried, the pain she held, the life she lived in the shadows, in the cold, in the silence that had become her home. George would take the pills with a nod, his hands trembling as he held the bottle, his eyes glistening with gratitude, his heart a little lighter, his fear a little less, his loneliness a little softer, knowing someone cared, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Sarah's act of kindness went unnoticed by most, a silent gesture in a world that rarely stopped to see the quiet heroes, the ones who gave without asking for anything in return, the ones who loved without expecting love back, the ones who kept going even when the world didn't care, even when the world didn't see, even when the world didn't know. But one person did notice, a person who saw more than most, a person whose own life had been touched by the kind of quiet heroism Sarah embodied, a person who knew the weight of a past unspoken, the power of a kindness unseen, the value of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. His name was Captain David Miller, a regular customer at Dawson's Pharmacy, a 45-year-old officer in the U.S. Air Force stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, a man who'd served in Iraq, who'd known men like George, who'd seen the toll, or took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that George carried, a silence David recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. David overheard Sarah and George one afternoon, his hands pausing as he picked up his own prescription, his ears catching the quiet exchange, the way Sarah's voice softened as she handed George the pills, the way George's eyes glistened with gratitude, the way the moment held a weight David couldn't ignore, a weight that spoke of kindness, of love, of a hero forgotten, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. He approached Sarah after George left, his voice steady as he asked about the man, about the pills, about the kindness she'd given, about the love she'd shared, even if she'd never known his name, even if she'd never known his story, even if she'd never known the man he'd been, the hero he'd been, the father he'd been, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. Sarah told him everything, her voice trembling as she spoke, her words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the shadows and the light. A bridge that brought George's story to life, that brought Sarah's kindness to light, that brought a hero back finally. After all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept him apart, David didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there. Knowing George's story deserved more, knowing Sarah's kindness deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. He drove back to Malmstrom Air Force Base that evening, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned, with the weight of what he knew he had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. He called his commanding officer, Colonel Rachel Evans, a woman who'd served in Korea, who'd known pilots like George, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence. That George carried, a silence Rachel recognized, a silence she understood, a silence she couldn't ignore. David told her everything, his voice steady as he spoke, his words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the shadows and the light. A bridge that brought George's story to life, that brought Sarah's kindness to light, that brought a hero back finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept him apart. On a bright Wednesday morning, the sound of jet engines filled the air above Whitefish, a roar that shook the windows, that stopped Sarah in her tracks, that made her heart pound with fear and curiosity. A sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected, a sound that would change everything, forever, for Sarah, for George, for the town of Whitefish, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their love, that would remember their kindness, their heroism, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo, louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the shadows that had kept them apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories for more untold tales of valor. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.